Tonight, we have Professor Luke Pittaway. And for those of you who don't know him, he is from the College of Business. I knew him originally when they were setting up the CoLab and from the Center for Entrepreneurship. He has also been a lead administrator in the College of Business. And I don't think it's an underestimate to say this place would not be here without his vision. So tonight, he's going to talk about spaces for entrepreneurship education, a new arms race, and I'm going to turn it over. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So hopefully everybody can hear me okay, and I won't talk too loud into the mic. So so the paper, we actually have a published paper on this. The published paper's title is University Spaces for Entrepreneurship, a Process Model, and we love the title, a Campus Arms Race, but unfortunately the reviewers didn't, so I decided that that's what we should call this cafe as a consequence. I should mention the paper actually and the work is done by myself, Rashida Azio, Michelle Ferrier, and Paul Mass. There are other members of the team, and a very large number of students were involved in this project. So this is the project. You're sat in the project. We have a research project, which is action research, which is also the outcome of the project is this physical space, the CoLab, that we went through a process of actually building. So, you know, in terms of the way I'm going to talk, I'm going to try and talk and then let questions occur and then just try and create a conversation. I will talk a little bit about infrastructure in entrepreneurship education. So there's a whole kind of field of research in the entrepreneurship subject, which is specifically on education. It's been around since the late 70s. And for some reason, nobody's talked about infrastructure. So this was literally one of the first projects that is looking at the role of infrastructure, physical space, in educational practices in entrepreneurship. And then we actually reviewed forms and types of buildings that universities have built all over the country. And so we wanted to understand, well, why are universities building physical spaces in entrepreneurship education to support university students that are interested in entrepreneurship? Where's this trend come from? Why is it happening? How did it get going? What's its purpose? And then we're going to focus on a little bit on some of the creativity and innovation literature that really focuses on what makes a space innovative. So when you think about innovation and entrepreneurship, and you're trying to design a physical space, like the space we're sat in right now, what do you need to put into that space to try to encourage innovation and entrepreneurship to occur? And then we'll talk a little bit about CoLab and some of the processes and the challenges that we went through in this process. So hopefully that makes sense as a kind of strategy for the conversation. In terms of entrepreneurship in a more general sense, entrepreneurship education has really been, initially was really focused on how do you enable students on a university campus to engage in venture creation. So it's very, very narrow, very focused on startups, on students starting businesses, on graduates starting businesses, sometimes on academics and students starting businesses together, but very, very focused on, purely on venture creation. And then in the recent history, it's really moved away from this kind of narrow focus on the venture creation process to focusing on, well, hang on a minute, entrepreneurship is a mindset, it's a skill set, it's competencies, it's behaviors. You can be entrepreneurial in a corporate context, you can be entrepreneurial in a social context, you can be entrepreneurial even in an academic context. So how do you train people to be entrepreneurial in the sense of a mindset and a set of competencies and behaviors that can be applied to lots of different contexts? So that opens you up from a narrow group of students who are just trying to start businesses and be the next, Facebook or Imager or whatever it is that they're trying to create, to pretty much all students that may be in some way entrepreneurial in their lives in different ways in different disciplines. And so what's happened in entrepreneurship is we've gone through this kind of like conversation about different forms of entrepreneurship. We've had things like talking about entrepreneurship. So how do you, a little like traditional educational practice where you're really learning the content. Like how do you do things like protect intellectual property? How do you, what forms of legal entities do you need to have if you're starting a business? About the things that you need to know, the knowledge. We've then started to get into forms of pedagogy that's really for entrepreneurship. So that's things like business plans, business model canvases, doing things that engage you in practices that actually allow you to pick up some skills that would enable you to be more entrepreneurial as a person. And then there's been a through Entrepreneurship Agenda, which is really more about students actually starting businesses on campus and learning as they run real ventures. So not just simulations and practical stuff that gets them to learn skills. This is actually, hey, we're running a real business on campus, and it's a class that enables us to pick up the skills of running those businesses. And then there's something called embedded, which I think is important for this conversation. Embedded entrepreneurship is trying to get entrepreneurship education embedded into specific disciplines. So if you're in, let's say, engineering, there are certain forms of entrepreneurial activities that you really need to understand that are relevant to engineering, but may not be relevant to business. If you're in arts and sciences, let's say a sculpture or you're an artist, certain forms of entrepreneurial behavior, self-employment, certain things that you need to know that you may not need to know in another discipline. So there's this form of embedded entrepreneurship. So there's been this kind of change in perception about what entrepreneurship education is for a campus and how it develops. And it's really gone from being a business school thing, where it's been really just about students in business schools and maybe some other students that are trying to start businesses, to like across the entire campus and embedded in disciplines. And so you'll see universities like Purdue where thousands of students are doing entrepreneurship education, and it's embedded in multiple disciplines across campus. And there are efforts to create institutes, centers, activities that spread across the entire campus. And so as this effort has occurred to spread entrepreneurship across an entire university campus, what you've started to see is like, well, actually, we need physical spaces for the students. If you're over there in engineering, you're doing something entrepreneurial, you want to meet the business students, and the business students really need to meet those creative students in arts. And so somehow we have to get this multidiscipline thing going, and we have to get it into some sort of focal point on campus to allow that to happen. And so there's been this trend to like, well, how do we make multidisciplined efforts occur when you're looking at various different groups of people coming together from very different backgrounds, trying to do entrepreneurial things together, bringing different skill sets together. And so what's happened is that universities have started to realize they have a lack of infrastructure. And so they've started to say, well, we really need to understand why we should be engaged in this infrastructure. And in actual fact, just so you know, entrepreneurship education is spreading across the system, educational system. So, primary education in elementary schools, in high schools, in college education, in graduate studies. Entrepreneurship education you can find anywhere in the education system, particularly in European countries where the governments have actually come forward with education policy to change the education system entirely to get it embedded across the entire system. So there's a couple of sort of drivers for this in the system that have led to universities across many countries now starting to build physical spaces. One was in the UK. It's called the Science Enterprise Challenge. So in the UK, they had a bunch of money, and they said, we really need our engineering and our science programs to think more about application of things they're inventing to take them out into industry and start businesses. So we're going to have this big effort across the whole country to embed entrepreneurship education in science and engineering education. This led to something called Centers for Excellence in the Teaching and Learning of Enterprise that then invested into physical infrastructure. This is great. It's embedded in engineering. It's embedded in chemistry and physics and across the entire campus, but nobody's talking to each other, and they've got no means to meet. And so let's find a way to build physical, innovative learning spaces that will allow the students to meet. The Kaufman Foundation back in the US kind of copied that, and they had these big grants, $5, $6, $10 million, to basically try and get universities in the US to start thinking about university-wide entrepreneurship education. And many of those universities, like North Carolina, Chapel Hill, kind of basically matched that money or tripled that money. And we're spending $15, $20 million trying to enhance entrepreneurship education across the entire campus and embed it in, and as a consequence, the same thing happened. They started to discover that they needed to kind of integrate things. And then there was this shift towards, like we have academic incubators where we're trying to help academics and graduate students start businesses. And the Innovation Center is a good example. I don't know if anybody's been to the Innovation Center here, but it's a very good example of an incubator started in the 90s that was designed to help start businesses as academics. And there was a kind of starting to begin the thinking of like, well, students do that too. Maybe we need incubators specifically to help students start businesses. And then, a lot of us will know, Gary certainly does, a lot of this is copying universities like MIT that have been very successful, and then copying companies like Google and IDEO and these other companies that have done really, really cool spaces that the students love to work in, and then they're coming back to our classrooms and going, the physical space isn't like, the places that we want to work in. It's not allowing us to be creative in the way that we want to be. I'm going to stop talking there and see if there's any questions at this point.
Excuse me, are you going to relate it specifically to OU as part of your talk?
Yes, yeah, that's where I'm going.
Okay.
Yep. Any other quick questions? Yeah?
Yeah, so far you've mentioned some colleges like engineering.
Yes.
I was wondering if embedded entrepreneurship could also apply to the humanities, some faculties where there are no hands-on activities.
Yeah, often, yes, absolutely. And often what you typically find is that you use different language. So you might use social impact, or you might use social entrepreneurship. You might lose the word entrepreneurship altogether and use innovation and creativity. Sometimes you get, a little bit pushback in social sciences, political science. It's like the word entrepreneurship is loaded in some ways for some disciplines. So you start to having conversations about, well, what are you really trying to do here? You're trying to be more creative. You're trying to be more innovative. You're trying to introduce experiential learning and problem-based learning into programs so that you're being more innovative. In some ways, entrepreneurship education is a little bit of a Trojan horse for more innovative educational practice, I would argue. And so sometimes, and it's also a license for professors to experiment a little with their educational practices. Okay, so what we came to is a quote that is actually from the New York Times, and they basically, I'm going to read this, they basically said, so they started to observe universities building these spaces, and I'll talk about the types of spaces that were being built. And they said, where once the campus amenities arms race was waged over luxury dorms and recreation facilities, now colleges and universities are building deluxe structures for the generation of wonderful ideas. They and their partners in industry are pouring millions of dollars into new buildings for business, engineering, and applied learning that closely resemble a high-tech workplace, itself inspired by the minimally partitioned spaces of the garage and the factory. So what we're seeing is some of these buildings are multi-million dollars. I mean, I've got a list here. We're talking about Cornell's 12-acre technology campus on Roosevelt Island. We're talking about University of Utah's $45 million LeSonde Studios, which is a dorm that is an entrepreneurship dorm. York University in Canada has a $25 million LeSonde School of Engineering. The University of Iowa's Art School was included. Wichita State's University Innovation Campus was included. So we're not just talking, in some cases, about small physical spaces like this. We're talking about entire campuses and entire efforts to redesign and rethink what a university infrastructure and physical space should actually be like. Is the physical space that we have today, which in many cases was designed for the 19th century and earlier 20th century kind of forms of educational practice, is it actually doing what it's designed to do, and do we need to rethink it and redesign it? And so in some cases you see these significant efforts to spend enormous amounts of money in these spaces in order to basically revolutionize and change the way in which education is occurring on university campuses. I could stop there and take a question. Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
Is there any planning around training faculty in the maker technologies so that they can better integrate it into their classes?
Yeah. So that gives me a good segue into the next bit I was going to talk about, and I'll talk about that as I do it. So when we think about entrepreneurship spaces, we have to decide, well, what do we mean by an entrepreneurship space? And so what we've identified in the research that we did were we looked at 57 universities that had different spaces on campuses. And what we've got is basically innovation dorms, so an entire physical space where people are living, working, having recreation facilities, and they have 3D printers and systems in, but it's an entire dorm. Right? I think Utah, the LeSonde Studios has like 300 bedrooms in it. And they're not the only one. There's not so many of those. There's like 2, 3. Certainly, Babson University has a freshman learning community, and some other universities have developed learning communities and changed dorms that are existing dorms into these learning communities, but they've not really rethought how the physical space actually is being designed. Then we have student accelerators and incubators. So these come in 2 different forms. They're sort of what I would call pre-incubator, and these are only focused on students trying to start businesses. So you have these sort of pre-incubators, which are more like this, where it's ideation space and kind of cool things going on that you will enable people to get together and start collaborate and think about things, and so they start businesses. And then full-on student incubators where they actually are running their business. They're physically located there. They're students. They're not academics, but they're students. But they are running their business. They have spaces that they are, renting out. Then you have the maker spaces and the Fab Labs. So the maker spaces and the Fab Labs are, prototyping facilities. And there are actually franchises. So Makerspace, well, the Fab Lab for certain is a franchise. I think it's MIT actually. And they basically came up with a concept, a Fab Lab, and they have these. They figured out exactly what machines and what training you need to have, and they franchised it to universities all over the world. In actual fact, because universities all over the place. So in that situation, they are. The franchise has all of the machines, all the suggestions of the design, the programming that needs to go with it, and then recommended training for people that are going to be running it as well. Makerspaces are a little looser. They tend to. Some of them are following a certain format, and others are just doing whatever they want.
So I guess I was getting at, how do you train faculty to be able to design learning experiences that take advantage of the technologies if the faculty don't know how the technologies work or what they can do or what their limitations are?
Yeah, there is programs all over the country that are designed specifically to change faculty thinking about their educational practice. So this is one of the problems when you build space. It's like you can build space, but is it going to get used properly? So you have to have programming in the space, and you have to have training for people to change educational practices so they use the space in the way that was intended. So yeah, absolutely agree with that point. And then the final space that this is really an example of is what we call in mixed-use teaching and learning spaces. So these have ideation space, they have collaboration space. So here you'll see ideation. There's a classroom over here. You've got meeting rooms that can be used for peer mentoring or for mentoring of entrepreneurs meeting students. You've got a larger meeting room. You've got open space you can have events in. You've got this also doubles up as collaboration space for students. You have a small maker space in the corner. So you've got a range of different things going on with the idea that you're going to maximize the physical, maximize the usage of that space. So for example, if you take a classroom, I've always wanted to put a classroom in any of these when we've designed them, because the classroom drives entrepreneurship student traffic. So we always put all the entrepreneurship classes and innovation and creativity classes into the classroom in the physical space. So you're driving the students that are interested in those things into the space that you're actually working with. Any other question? Yeah, location's important. I mean, this is in the library for a reason. Sorry?
Just repeat the question.
Oh, so the question was, how do you ensure that the space isn't just used by effectively one group of students, in this case, business students? Now, that's an interesting question, because in some cases, these spaces are designed to be in a college. So a lot of the maker spaces, like you'll have different types of maker spaces. You have wet labs as well, that are designed to be incubators or that are designed specifically for different types of students. You'll have Fab Labs that are in engineering facilities. You'll have Fab Labs that are in fine arts. So spaces, you'll have an entrepreneurship center a bit like this that's in a College of Business building. So there are, dedicated facilities. And in some cases, like Arizona State University is a good example, they have a network of spaces. So they have central spaces that are designed for collaboration of students from different disciplines, and then they'll have other spaces that are specifically discipline specific. And when we designed this, we were aware that, for example, that engineering is going to build a makerspace in the new engineering building, and fine arts is going to build a new collaboration space in the fine arts building. So we didn't want to duplicate what they were doing when we designed this. We wanted to make sure this was the hub that was working with the spokes that are in the colleges. So certainly location becomes important, physical space, where you put it. So it being in the library here is really important. I mean, this, the fact that the College of Business here led the program, and the Center for Entrepreneurship, which actually does serve all students across campus, isn't just College of Business students, is here, has led this to be used a little bit more by College of Business students. But in general, the space is designed to be used by students from any discipline. And so the key is then is like marketing, is making sure students know about it, getting the word out in terms of the space itself.
So looking at that, I don't know at the undergraduate level, is just a general course in entrepreneurship required? I mean, as we see that everything is shifting within the field of
Yep.
education and within all of our areas, seems to me like something like that should be a great required course. And then I teach doctoral students, and since most of them throughout their career will always end up having to have something on the side if they.
Yep.
So, sorry.
So I've got three answers. So the yes, and yes. So
Why don't we have, like they need, so I brought my class with me, why don't we have things here that, every doc student needs to sit in, because sure, they may go back and do whatever, but it would also be great for them to share their knowledge and experience and be able to collaborate with all these different.
yeah. So there's really three answers to that. Well, the first one is many universities now have entrepreneurship as a general education requirement. So no, we don't. I worked really hard to get our introduction to entrepreneurship class into the themes that we used to have for for general education. It's changing again, but that when we were doing that, we don't have that. But Purdue does. I mean, Purdue has like thousands of students doing entrepreneurship because it's in the general education requirements. Many universities are trying to do the same things. Like every student should do something in entrepreneurship. Is the argument. With regard to PhDs and postdocs, they should all have training in entrepreneurship, because there are many, many issues that, particularly for the science students and the engineering students, that come up that they need to understand. And we did actually have a research and enterprise program that we used to do here for PhD and postdoctorate students. I think it's discontinued right now, but we ran that through Tech Growth Ohio for at least 4 times, and every time we ran it, there was like 20, 25 students were in it. And when I was back in Sheffield in the UK, we ran a program for many years that was specifically designed at postdocs. Because answering the third question is, like, particularly in science engineering, many of those students are like, they're the most likely people to be entrepreneurs, academic entrepreneurs, because, number one, it's really hard to get a professorship in certain areas of science. They're very, very competitive. Number two, you're starting to get, like, too qualified for certain jobs. And number three, you're right at the cutting edge of the bench science. And so you're actually in a really, really good position to be able to say, okay, this is how this could be applied and taken forward as a business. So in many cases, that group, and you're also young, you're used to, living off not very much money and ramen noodles and, like one grant to the next. Your PhD and postdoc life is quite entrepreneurial by definition. And so it's not a great shift to go, oh, I'll just start a business and I'll grow it. Now, the challenge, of course, is the science can be, you have to be able to take the science to business, and sometimes science is too far away from being able to be applied to business. That's created a few more questions, so let's go with that conversation. I think this will be back first.
I want to know how different Untitled Chapter is for social enterprise.
Mhm.
So different for that of the sciences, because for nonprofits, for instance, you don't have any product that you are putting out on the market. So what would be that distinguishing feature?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we literally, I actually do a theories of entrepreneurship class, and we actually talk about social entrepreneurship on Tuesday. I mean, it basically, there's not a lot of difference between commercial and social entrepreneurship, honestly. You're still running an enterprise. The big difference is the social value. So what are you actually trying to achieve when you're running your social, what is the end value? What is the end purpose? You're trying to create, social value for society, and so what is it that is that social value? What is that social wealth? So the way in which you run a venture really doesn't change that much, really, but what really changes is what you're trying to do with the venture. Sorry, there's yeah.
I'm particularly interested in your comments about advanced students, graduate
Mhm.
students. In my industrial experience, what we found was that many of the very well-educated academic students, chemists, chemical engineers, were interested in academic knowledge and couldn't understand that they were working in an industry that had to have a product.
Mm-hmm.
And they need that entrepreneurship
Yep.
training to break this barrier between
Yeah. It's funny you should say that. I once did a chemistry entrepreneurship class, and I worked with a firm that were interested in working with us, and they had like 50 employees. Of those 50 employees, 45 were PhDs in chemistry. And the reason they wanted to work with us, because they were like, by doing this, we will educate the people that work for us about the process of, actually trying to launch ventures in chemistry. And so while we were actually teaching the students that were doing chemistry entrepreneurship classes, they were interested in having their employees mentor those students so they could be educated about how to actually commercialize their own research work. It's quite interesting. There's a question at the back.
So you're talking about the physical location.
Yes.
And the training. But I have heard in some other universities where there's actual people who are getting, like from students, this is the plan, where they examine it and see. Because so many students have so many ideas that can turn to great businesses. So what they do, they bring experts to help these students start their businesses, and then they get like a kind of like shareholder of the company or the idea when they sell it.
Yeah.
How can you link, like, okay, the physical location is very important, the training is very important, but when it comes to the actual work, how this can help the students to start their businesses?
Yeah, there's often, programming. Yeah, sorry, there is often programming designed to do exactly those sorts of things. So, for example, many universities will have accelerators, which is specifically designed program to help students launch ventures. So you can have physical space, but if you don't have the programming, that's part of the research outcomes, was like you need to have the program in place to be able to facilitate that. And even on this campus, we have undergraduate students doing business plans with mechanical engineering and electrical engineering students. So they're doing their final design classes, they're coming up with good solutions, and then they have other students doing business plans with them. And we actually have a group of students that are doing Jim Zoo's autonomous car vehicle stuff. They're actually at a couple of business plan competitions and being very successful so far. They're in the semi-final of the Rice business plan competition, which is like $1.5 million pot. And they might actually raise some money to start a business by doing a business plan and then going to business plan competition. So yeah, that is a thing. I think you had a question here, and then I should probably talk about some of the innovation principles behind physical space.
So how do we get into the system such that, my concern is doc students, how do we get it such that this becomes part of a doc student's regular program of study? I mean, are they offered at the doctorate level without them having to take a prerequisite? If we're looking at ones who are thinking, hey, I have some great ideas, but, I want to see if it really works or if I can apply it and sure, they get the theory, but it's much more important to me that they can actually apply it and do it. So does OU offer something like that doc students can enroll in? And if not, why not? And I understand administration slowing, we're not going to do this, but why don't we do that if we want to continue to say, look what OU does?
Yeah, not at the moment. Yes, we should. I mean, is the simple answer. And I'm going to go into some of the principles, I think, as well of the innovation of the space. Sorry.
I appreciate it.
I just also wanted to make sure that at some point you touch on Startup Weekend and some of the programming that does allow co-curricular, experiences.
Yeah. So there's lots. Just to answer that question, I did want. Yeah. It is something that would be a good idea, and it is something that we should do. I will also tell you that. I'm actually doing research on doctoral training right now in entrepreneurship education. So this is kind of a new thing that bothers me slightly. We train professors in entrepreneurship to be researchers, but we don't train them, as far as I can tell, and I'm doing research on this right now, to actually teach. And yet, entrepreneurship education, by definition, is supposed to be innovative teaching. That's the one thing that we know we're supposed to be doing, is like we're supposed to be introducing and experimenting with innovations in teaching practice. And yet we're not actually training people to be educators, we're training them to be researchers. I know that's a problem for doctoral education in many, many disciplines, but that's a particular problem in entrepreneurship. And so that's something that I'm interested in. So there are issues around that as well as the commercial kind of, and again, you'd have to say they're learning the research side of it, but they're not learning the commercial side of it. Well, that's great, but then you're going to be mentoring students and other people that are trying to start businesses and you've never done it yourself. Maybe you've done something a little bit before you started your PhD, but you may not have been a successful entrepreneur. You've been an academic, so that's a problem. So just to say, just quickly on the Startup Weekend thing, we do have, there is a lot of programming that is available. So we're doing Startup Weekends, which is like a weekend long, which actually I think this came from. Last weekend, students get together and they basically, well, not just students and the community get together and they basically form teams around ideas and then spend the entire weekend trying to launch a business. We have something called iCore at Ohio, which is really for science students with faculty, PhD, postdoc students, maybe an undergraduate student and an entrepreneur, form a team around usually some sort of intellectual property that's science-based, and then get funding to actually, from the state, to basically try to start that business. And it's very early stage kind of stuff. We actually have something called Tech Growth Ohio, which is is actually venture capital finance. The Center for Entrepreneurship has a seed capital grant. So there is actually a lot on campus. We could talk more about that too. So I just wanted to change tack a little bit and just tell you a little bit about the methodology that we did with the research, and then just go through some of the innovation principles that we were identifying in the research for how to make a space actually help innovation occur. So the first thing, let me just go to the methodology quickly. So really what we were trying to do is make this space happen. So the space you're in right now, when we started this research, it was like, we want to build a physical space on OU's campus for entrepreneurship. Question is, what do we build? So we have, obviously we're limited by what space you're actually going to use. That limits to a certain extent what you're going to do. But you have to know before you build something, especially if you're going to spend $1 million, which is what this cost. What is it we're actually going to try to do? So we started doing action research. So action research is, some people don't like it in academia because it's sort of consultancy. It's a form of work where you are actively trying to solve a problem while doing research at the same time, collecting data on that problem. And it's kind of iterative because what you're doing is you're collecting data for a purpose, you're allowing that purpose to inform your practice, then you're going back out to collect more data. So it's a very iterative process, and it's multi-methods as well. So you're not really, you're collecting the data and you're using the method that makes sense for that particular purpose at that particular time. So just give you that context. So we did analysis of 57 universities in the US of spaces that they'd built. We'd looked at the characteristics, the users, we analyzed websites, we downloaded pictures, we looked at content. A lot of the time we did a lot of work with pictures. So a lot of the research, we didn't do any real coding with pictures. We try to get down that with another project. We're looking at trying to do that. But we have a lot of picture information that we were using in this research. Then we did a market analysis. So on this campus, we had to really understand, what do students want in a physical space? So there was a fairly crude, not very academically sophisticated survey that the students did that were involved in this project to find out what other students wanted from a space like this. They also did focus groups. They went into classes and did focus groups with students groups, and then they also talked to particular student groups that were already interested in were already doing entrepreneurial things. It's like, if you had a space, what would you want it to do? We then did a lot of visits. So a student team and faculty members picked sort of case study sites, and then they went out, and this is where we had the grant. We had a $15,000 innovation grant to do a sort of feasibility study, and we spent pretty much most of that money was spent on visits to campuses where other universities have built spaces, and a faculty member and a student went there. We went Harvard, iLab, we went North Carolina, Chapel Hill's got 2 accelerator programs. We went to Arizona State, to Utah, and at least 2-3 other universities that I haven't listed. Then we did a whole bunch of Skype interviews. So we did Skype interviews with anybody that was running a space. So you built the space, what's wrong with it? What's great with it? What would you wish you had put in if you had another chance? And really kind of try to understand what the people running the spaces were saying about the spaces. We then went back to the 57 examples and did a more systematic analysis of those examples to try to fit them into some categories and typologies and things that we had designed. And then we did design and construction of the space. So design and construction is two different stages. Design is obviously the architectural bit with interior designers and just, with real proper architectural drawings and doing everything that you need to do. And then construction's like, okay, we put the restroom in the wrong place, or we had to move the toilet. I mean, it doesn't line up with the toilet that's upstairs, so we better move it. This wall has to move slightly. There was just lots of little pieces of construction. Oh, are we going to keep these 3 walls in here, or shall we remove them? There's just lots of bits and pieces that go wrong, and you can imagine very technical and quite boring. My entire summer construction project. So I'm going to. Any questions there in terms of methodology, action research as a methodology? I know we have some PhD students, so I just want to check. No? Okay, so I'll go on to the next bit. So, one of the things that was really frustrating me when we started this work was, if you're going to design a space for innovation and entrepreneurship, what makes a space help people be innovative? And we started to do a lot of literature research in that. And the first thing I know is, entrepreneurship education is a thing. There's hundreds and hundreds of people, professors all over the world doing research on entrepreneurship education. 2019, this is the first paper that's been published on physical space in entrepreneurship education. There's stuff on co-working spaces, there's a little bit on incubators, but there isn't anything on physical space. So we couldn't use the entrepreneurship education literature to help us answer that question. So we had to go beyond that. We went into architecture, we went into creativity literature, we went into education. And the one observation, if there's any education researchers here, I know there's a few of you, this is like a gap. There's really not much, even in the architectural literature. I'm assuming there's loads of stuff in the architectural literature, but it's not in the academic papers. It's in, the grey literature or the white literature. It's not in, there really isn't that much written about what makes space innovative for educational practices, and then really not much written about the role of physical space in education and how it helps and hinders education. I mean, I was surprised by that. I mean, it may be that we missed a whole bunch of stuff, but that would be my general observation, is this is a big space that doesn't have an awful lot done on it. So anyway, just to move on, we found certain things that would, factors that encourage innovation. So the first factor is configuration. So the configuration of the space is the design, the setup, the flow, how the different bits of the space work together. So how do you move from one bit of space to the next? Adjacency of space. So have you got the ideation or the classroom next to a breakout space? Have you got a working space that's open that people will walk across and talk to somebody else? What you're seeing in configuration is communal space needs to be accessible. So you notice that we've got a big event space here. It can be used for all sorts of different things. Lots of flexible furniture. You can move it all around. You can do anything you want with it. But it's very accessible. From here, anybody coming into the communal space is accessible to any other spaces. Typically, you're seeing open plan, flat structures, taking out walls, no corridors. The open space tends to be in the middle. The private space tends to be around the outside. So you've seen these circular and radial configurations. It's very important to think about the flow. And there's this concept of serendipitous exchanges. So you should encourage a space where you're moving between two spaces to end up in a conversation that you wouldn't have expected because you're hanging around a certain bit of the space. So there's this idea that serendipitous exchanges need to be encouraged in an innovative space. And then configurations have to have a combination of formal and informal. We were finding that, you think about ideation and everybody thinks that ideation should be collaborative. But when you do the research, you realize that actually ideation is also thinking. And so there has to be private, personal space. So a lot of these places have got it wrong by making it very, very collaborative, very noisy, very open, and having absolutely no private space. And so what is evident in the research is that you do actually need to have this, ideation space needs to be private space as well as public space. Then another criteria that jumped out is biophilia. So biophilia is like connection to the natural environment. Fortunately, this was a bit difficult in this space, although you will notice for anybody that was in the faculty commons before, we have got much more natural light into the space. But the ability to see the environment, the ability to get natural light in, the ability to have materials in the space that are natural materials like wood, you know, anything that is drawing the natural environment into the space is considered to improve the likeliness that innovation and creativity will occur in the space. The next one's socio-petal. So socio-petal designs are human-centric. So this is like maximizing collaboration, maximizing ideation, flexibility. You can move things around. You'll notice that furniture, generally speaking, is fairly movable in this space. You've got interaction built into the design. It's supposed to encourage interaction. You know, I laugh at the education building. Anybody? You in the new Patton College? Where it says, we were reviewing that building when we were looking at doing this, and I love the furniture and I love the layout, but it basically says you got stickers on some of the furniture. Don't move the furniture. And I'm like, that is exactly not what you should be doing. And also, the furniture is too heavy to move anyway. So that isn't what you would want to do if you were trying to create a creative environment, because actually you should be able to. You notice everything can be moved around. It's messy sometimes, but that's okay. You should be trying to avoid single ownership of space and single occupancy. We've had a bit of a problem with this ideation space. People close the doors. You notice there's signs on the door saying don't close the door. It's supposed to be, you know, lots of people in there doing ideation in teams and stuff, and loud and messy. And you know, every now and again you'll walk past and one person's in there and the door's closed. And it's like, that wasn't what we intended. And so it should maximize modifiability. There should be lots of variation in walls and seating, in lighting arrangements. We got that wrong in this space. We have no modifiability in the lighting, really. And we tried to change that, but it was kind of expensive. And then there should be symbols that highlight to the users how the space should be used. So you'll probably see that a little bit around this space. We do have some symbols that kind of say, you know, use this space in this way. So you know, you're really kind of allowing the user to be creative and innovative in the space. The next one's materialization. This one stands out as kind of a big deal. This is the labs. Like if you want a space that is going to allow people to be entrepreneurial and creative, you have to get from ideation to physical, like prototypes, physical, whatever it is, something physical that is what in academic terms we're calling materialization. It's the actual entity, the transforming of ideas into something that actually is tactile. Sorry. So that's where the labs are coming in. It's allowing people to do that, and you know, it's allowing gestation space, it's allowing thinking space, it's reflecting space, it's allowing sensory experiences, drawings. You know, this is why this is here. You know, this thesis. I don't know if you've tried that, but if you walk in front of it, the wall changes and stuff. And this is somebody's PhD project. But it is kind of what you're trying to do. You're trying to, you know, engage the user in the space in a physical way. The next one's smart technology. Like you walk into a building, you know it's smart. It comes across as being smart. That tells you you're supposed to be smart in it. So that's like things like intelligent technologies that change things when you walk around. You know, a lot of bringing the virtual interaction into the space. You'll notice most of the rooms, conference rooms, are set up with various different types of video conferencing. So if you're in those little rooms, you can do Skype calls very easily. If you're in this big room, this has got proper video conferencing set up in it. Actually, that's ended up being a problem. That's too complicated. The simple stuff's the better. And then there's smart sensors, there's smart environmental technologies that use in the space properly. And then the other one, the final one, I don't know if it's the final one, we're nearly near the final one, is interesting. So interesting space is like aesthetically interesting. So this is where sculpture, art, you know, curvy walls and, you know, things that are kind of doing things slightly different from a typical space. It's not square and boring, you know. Art, sculpture, interior design, ergonomics, those all become important in terms of the user, you know, being inspired to be innovative in the space. Symbolism is important. So a lot of these spaces, when you go to the like the incubators, they will have like, you know, all the logos of all the companies that have been successful. It's like you get on the wall when you've launched a successful business. Or, you know, we talked here, we're supposed to be having there's supposed to be an innovation wall here, by the way, about all the history of innovation for the university. That's what's supposed to be on this wall. Unfortunately, I think we ran out of money in the end. But that's what's supposed to be there, because it's supposed to tell everybody that this space is for innovation and entrepreneurship. And yeah, and you should see that in a lot of these spaces. There's stories. Sometimes they're really in your face, kind of explicit. Like other times, it's a little bit sort of like implicit. So like Facebook, you'll go around Facebook, and yeah, it's Facebook, and they have all the what's the company Oracle took over? I've forgotten the name of the company. They have my brother worked for the company. I've forgotten the name. Anyway, maybe I'll remember it in a minute. But this company got bought out by Oracle and discontinued, and effectively kind of failed. You've got it, haven't you? Anyway, I might remember it. Anyway. And Facebook bought the building, but they left all the symbols from the old company to remind them you can't get too big to fail. So when people are walking around Facebook, there's all these symbols for this old company, like we left them there. So we were trying to remind people that you can't, all of our people, that you can't get too big to fail. So this kind of symbolization bit. And then the final bit is obviously the program. We talked about that. It's all great having a space, but if you don't have the right programming in the space, then it doesn't help you be innovative. So I'm going to stop there and just take any further questions, and I've got a little bit left, and then.
As you looked at everything, were they all disability friendly? Did they make, like, for wheelchairs, visual, deaf, do they have anything like that would, as we see our numbers climbing and knowing that we have returning veterans who may have did you see any of that mentioned specifically in all of these places that you examined?
I can't say I saw that mentioned in any of the literature specifically, but I mean these days, whenever you do up a building, we had to talk about that. I mean, you'll notice with the bathrooms are much bigger here, and you're always.
You can't really adjust the tables on some of these for wheelchairs.
Yeah.
Some of them have real-time deaf interpreters and all.
Yeah, no, that didn't. That will be why, because we did. I mean, it didn't. I mean, you have compliance that you have to. There's things you have to comply with, and then beyond that, I don't think it really featured.
I was wondering.
But it's a good point.
I think Stanford's space.
Is that 5 minutes?
No. I was just going to jump in and say that I remember when they were picking out the furniture, and one of the ADA compliant issues that they had was they wanted to have the lounge furniture, but then they said, no, you have to have some with backs on them. And also, as Matt said, the tables are all designed for ADA compliance as well.
But you get a bit stuck too. I mean, you get this kind of, because I went through the process with the design and construction team for this space. Sometimes you have to make compromises based on cost, and it's like, we really want to do that, but like, for example, the configuration of the lighting, that went because we couldn't afford to do it. And it was like, we've run out of money, we can't do that. The wall has gone because we've run out of money. So it's like, well, that's a shame.
I have a question. So one of the things that I thought was really distinctive when I walked in here for the first time was the color scheme.
Right.
And I think that it works really well. But did everybody else in design, did everybody buy into this very interesting color combination?
Well, what happened there was actually, yes, funny enough, because what happened was that we had like prototypical pictures that all of the students and the faculty were looking at. And, one of the prototypical picture was an ideation space that really jumped out at everybody. This is it. And it happened to be this color. And so what the interior designers went off that. And we're really lucky that we could get beyond the kind of traditional green, because even in the buildings on campus, you have to have OU colors. And so this is kind of unique that we got out of that. And actually kind of important, because green isn't really, when you think about green, it's not really a creativity, innovation type color. There were other colors you could have used. Pink's not the only one, but it's not obvious.
Was it PeopleSoft? Was that the company that Oracle?
No, I don't know. I'm going to.
When I think of startups, I think
Sun Microsystems. Got it. Sorry.
When I think of startup spaces, I think of ping pong tables, beanbag chairs, tables full of sandwiches. You don't have those amenities.
Yeah, no, we didn't. We had those conversations. Utilization of space is problematic with ping pong tables. They don't really utilize the space well. We actually got to a point at one point where we were in a different physical space, so we were going to be in central classroom. The university catering actually got up to a point where we were going to do an honor code with food. Like the food was going to be there, and you would just sign up and you would swipe your card, and it was going to be an honor code. They were up for that, which I was quite amazed with. We talked about in this space putting in robotic vending machines, but a lot of the catering got killed off when we moved here because we have a cafe downstairs. So it's like, in the end, it was like, well, we'll do what we can with having a kitchen space, and supplying coffee, and when we have events, there's lots of foods and stuff, but we won't put in a cafe because there isn't really a need because of the one downstairs. But yeah, I mean, when you think about some of these spaces, food, and in actual fact, that was the one thing that came out of the research, and all the students were like adamant, it must have a kitchen. It must have free food. It must have free coffee. And it's like, the university's not going to buy into that, but yeah, I agree.
Have you run into incidences where probably students are working and they might not they might not have access to some equipment, and how do you probably resolve that, so that you can still encourage?
Yeah, I mean that's where having a maker space because when we first opened this, there was no equipment in here that you could do the materialization bit. So that's been sort of addressed recently. But I haven't found that students have really needed much. I mean, the biggest challenge we face in this space, I think, is the fact that we're in the library. Well, on the one hand, that's the biggest benefit for the success here, is that it gets used a lot because we're in the library. It is one of the disadvantages it gets used a lot because we're in the library. I mean, basically what's going on there is that many people just come and do the homework in here. And so then that's like, is it really fulfilling the mission that we set for the space? Possibly not. But then I will also argue, I've seen people in here actually doing their homework in a different way because of the space. So then I'm like, well, hang on a minute. Let's not be too quick to judge the fact that people are doing their homework in here because they're actually doing their homework in a different way because the space allows it. And it's a bit like the teaching and learning thing when we come back to that. It's like, if you have traditional classrooms, you're not really allowing your professors to teach in a different way. So you have to design your classrooms in such a way that it gives permission to the professors, and so to actually teach in a different way. So we sometimes, you then have to talk to the professors, talk to the students, like this is, and that's where the symbolization bit comes in. It's like, actually put a symbol up in the wall, we even talked about having a big symbol on the wall with a traditional classroom and the professor stood at the front and the chairs all in rows and them lecture into it and then a big X over it. It's like, make sure the professors know that they're not supposed to lecture in this classroom. I think, and if you think about what we deal with classroom infrastructure, it's a fundamental problem for most universities where the vast majority of infrastructure is not designed for the pedagogical practices that we're typically doing today. And so that is a fundamental problem that most universities are facing. And I think part of the reason why there's so much money going into entrepreneurship education, physical space, is partly actually to address some of those issues. And also students want it. I mean, you think about it, you're going to go and work for Google or Facebook or Microsoft, and you're working in an environment like this, and yet your university spaces are 100 years old. It's a problem.
Last question.
I was one of those successful creative engineers that maybe out of 21 patents, I used the green color, only I used it in a different venue. I think out of those 21, maybe 6 came from an idea in the middle of a stream with a fly rod.
There you go, yeah.
But,
yep.
I unfortunately only got $1 for each of those patents, but
Yeah.
that's a little paper you sign the first day when you
Yeah.
sign up for a large company anyway.
Yeah, that is definitely one of the things that came out of the research, was like many of these spaces were making a mistake where they thought all innovation is collaborative. And so, if we get into the kind of, the conceptual bit of the, yeah, that's what I'm saying. If you get into the research bit of the paper, there is a conceptual framework that looks a bit like that. And we've got cognitive forms of innovation, we've got social forms of innovation, and then we've got supporting factors. And so then what we did was we mapped that against the different forms. So we're then saying, okay, well, if you're doing this type of space, it really needs to have more of the cognitive forms of it. So if it's early stage, for example, and you've got ideation going on, you'll have some collaborative forms of ideation, but you also need some private forms of ideation. Also, if it's a later stage and you've actually started a business, you're going to need some private space for the business. It's not going to be all collaborative space. So the different forms of spaces require different configurations of these factors. And also these factors fall into different forms of innovation. And the other one that was pretty evident for a lot of the spaces, Babson had this problem. They designed spaces without thinking about the audio part. And so they had these wonderful collaboration spaces that nobody would work in because you couldn't hear anything.
Am I live? Yes, I'm live. Okay, good. So, before we thank our speaker, I do have two things. Remember, we do have the next Science Cafe next Wednesday. We'll be back in the front room. It's 3D printing as related to health. Also, April 9th is the Student Expo. And at that is where we showcase our research and creative activity of our students at this university. What I like to always say is that students present their research and creative activity any way that's legal and safe. But as part of that, we have the pitch competition, where students present their ideas, and we have the preliminary trials in the morning. In the afternoon, at 4 o'clock here in the CoLab, we will have the final heats. We are calling it the Student Expo After Party. You are all invited. So at this point, I want to turn it back over to the speaker just for final comments, but before we do, let's thank him with a round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Rox. I just want to say thank you. I did want to just plug the paper. This is actually published now, so 2019 January. So if anybody's actually interested in the paper, it's 2019. So I am working on citations right now, trying to get people to cite the paper. So please email me, and I'll share it with you. And I've got my business cards here as well, so if you want to get my email off me. So thank you. And I'm going to stay here for a bit, so if anybody wants to talk, happy to do that too.